Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this breakout session of using the Period of Purple Crying program to prevent infant abuse. Before I introduce our speaker, I have a couple of reminders. So this session is being recorded and will be made available on the conference platform an hour after the session ends. We welcome you to put your questions or comments in the chat box on the conference platform. That way they are available for those who were unable to attend this session, and so they can see the questions that are being asked. If you want to ask your question, feel free to raise your hand and we will work to get you unmuted so that we can ask questions towards the end of the presentation. So I'm excited to introduce to you our speaker, Rochelle Soden, and she is going to get us started with our session.
Awesome. Thanks, Carrie. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's session. I'm super happy to be here with you. I'm going to invite you to turn on your video cameras. It is not a requirement, but if you have ever done trainings and talks virtually, you know it's really hard to talk to a bunch of black boxes. So if you're able to turn on, great. If you're not in a space where you can, I also totally understand that as well. So again, it's not a requirement, but it is appreciated. So as Carrie said, we're here to talk about how we can use a program called Period of Purple Crying to prevent infant abuse. And I have a prompt on the first screen that you should be able to see that is in the chat. I do actually have both chats up if you're on Zoom or you're on the platform. Share what your favorite thing is about working with kiddos or families. What is it that you like about what you do? What thing comes to mind that sparks joy with working with children or families? I'll kind of watch the chats as I'll give you a moment to think about that. For me, what I like about working with kiddos, I actually love teens, which I know is a little older than what most of you probably work with, but I like the teenage group because they are unabashedly fearless in telling you what they think. And I really like that they don't care about being politically correct. So Amanda, I appreciate you putting in the Zoom chat that you love their humor. Yes. And Michelle, you're saying watching them grow and develop in the relationships you make with the parents and children. Yeah, absolutely. And Misty, you're saying you like to help families work through issues and find new ways to problem solve. Yes. And sometimes our families just need that little extra support and push or redirection to think about, have you thought about this? Or have you considered this way? And it just gives them a new way of thinking about how something might be achievable that they didn't think was prior to. And Brittany, you're saying I work with parents and new babies. I'm so happy you're here since you work with new babies, because that's a group that we're going to be specifically talking about. And you love the excitement and all the emotions. Yes. And Gail, you're also saying the relationships made. So these are just great. And I know if you attended the keynote session just a little bit ago, she was talking about your purpose and your why and renewing your energy and your own resiliency. And so this kind of ties into that, because this is a little heavier topic. So I'm super happy that you all came to it, because it is an important topic. But by the end of this session, you should have some strategies and some tools that you can use for how to hopefully use a program in your prevention efforts in conjunction with the other ways that you're already talking with families. So I appreciate those of you who are putting the chat in there. So a little bit about myself and my organization. I work for Kansas Children's Service League. We are the state chapter for Prevent Child Abuse America. And that's the division that I work in, Prevent Child Abuse Kansas. And we have a mission of protecting and promoting the well-being of children. We've been around for a really long time. I've been part of the agency for 23 years, and I'm currently in the role of training manager and have a lot of national certifications and oversee a lot of our statewide prevention training programs and strengthening families programs. And so one of the programs that I oversee is the Period of Purple Crying. But before we get too far into the nitty-gritty of that specific program, I want to set this up by talking about why we even need prevention for the specific of abusive head trauma, which is also known as shaken baby syndrome. I want to talk a little bit about the things that go into why that specific type of physical abuse even exists, and then what we can do to actually prevent it from happening. And so I have some quiz questions built into this training for you. And there's nothing to click on your screen, but if you want to put your answers in the chat, that's great, because I will also be watching the chat for those. But do you think this is true or false, that the majority of child deaths related to child abuse are among ages 0 to 4? What do you guys think on this? Is this true? Is this false? I've got a bunch of truths, some question marks, a false. It's okay if you don't know the answer, or if you don't have the right answer, that's also okay. So this is actually true. And there's a lot of reasons that this is true, but we know it's true because this is actually tracked through our state data and also through national data. But when we think about these deaths happening in these younger populations, we oftentimes think about it in this, what happens out there. It's the story that we hear about, it's not close to home, or it doesn't feel like a reality, particularly when we're dealing with abuse situations. And so I wanted to just share with you some current national stories that are related to shaken baby syndrome. This is a headline story that happened where a child was shaken and survived, but then recently passed away just shy of turning 12. So this is also a case that can happen with shaken baby syndrome, where a child does survive, but then has complications that result in a death later on. This particular child was shaken at 2 years of age and has long-term consequences from being shaken. This is a situation where a child was shaken at a young age, but actually graduated high school, and of course requires a lot of additional supports and services to get through this and to function at this level, but has kind of a happier outcome, if you can say that, from an abuse situation. And then this is a highly unfortunate story, which I can send a link to someone who might be interested in this. This is a 3-part story on CNN, and this family is actually going to be featured at the upcoming National Center for Shaken Baby Syndrome conference on the situation with their little girl. But we tend to think about these national stories as like, well, that's something that happens over there or out on one of the coasts, but it happens here in Kansas too. So these are a few of the abusive head trauma cases that we track here in Kansas. And what I like to point out with shaken baby syndrome and abusive head trauma is that we don't actually get to know really solid state data on how often shaken baby syndrome occurs, because if the child survives, our Department for Children and Family does not track and differentiate a shaken baby syndrome physical abuse case from straight physical abuse. So the cases we do know about are the ones that come through an unfortunate death, and that is tracked through the Child Death Review Board through our Attorney General's office. So we can generalize some of our statistics and prevalence for how often this happens. And according to the National Center for Shaken Baby Syndrome, which is our national partner that we work with, there's around 1,300 known cases of abusive head trauma every year, but oftentimes those symptoms are misdiagnosed or underreported because hospitals don't recognize the symptoms. And so we actually think the rates are probably much higher. What we do know, though, is that 25% of the victims will not survive. And those that do, typically the majority are going to have some form of long-term complication from being shaken. So it is a very damaging and a very deadly form of physical abuse. And specifically, shaken baby syndrome is used interchangeably with the term abusive head trauma. And it's a form of abuse that occurs when a young child or infant is violently shaken or thrown or hit against a hard surface. And usually it's going to cause severe brain damage. The shaking can last a very brief time, but it can cause irreparable damage. And what we also know is that the injuries received from being shaken or abusive head trauma conditions do not look like anything else. So if a child's in a rollover car accident, for example, their injuries are going to look very different than if they were shaken. And so it's something that we need to keep in mind. So it's a terrible form of abuse, and I promise we're going to get to more positive pieces, but I think it's important to set this up. So I want to talk a little bit about why shaken baby syndrome, abusive head trauma happens, because it does happen, unfortunately. So we need to have an understanding as to what leads to it. So I have another quiz question here for you. True or false? All babies go through a period of increased crying as part of normal child development. Do we think this is true, or do we think this is false? Got a lot of trues coming in. Okay, excellent. That is the correct answer. So I'm super glad that all of you are answering true and that you know this. How about this one? Do we think that a baby may cry for 5 to 6 hours at a time and still be considered part of normal child development? What do we think here? And Carrie, while I wait for some of those answers to come in, I'm just going to do a sound check real quick because can you hear snoring in the background? I'm getting no. Okay, that's great. I have an English bulldog, y'all. And if you know anything about English bulldogs, they're loud. And while she's not in my office, I can hear her from the hallway. So I'm hoping that's not transmitting. So I've got a kind of some mixed answers coming in here, some trues, some falses, a question 5 to 6 hours continuously. That's a great question, Brittany. And so the answer to this is actually, yes, this is true. So, and yes, the answer is actually 5 to 6 hours continuously. So that's a lot of crying, y'all, that can happen, right? And so what we're really looking at here are two main facts. One is that all babies go through a developmental stage of increased crying. That's just part of normal child development. And what we also know is that shaking most often occurs in response to a baby's crying, because when we're around a baby that is crying that much, that can be really exhausting, really stressful, really frustrating. And we really need to be mindful of how our own emotional responses are being to a high crying baby. And so it's this inconsolable crying that we want to be thinking about, how do we address? Because when shaking occurs, as I've kind of already alluded to, there's a wide range of responses that can happen. So death, of course, is one of the ones we've already talked about, with 25% of children not surviving. But those that do, the 80% are going to have some form of long-term damage or disability or impact from being shaken. These kids on your screen I've actually met. What's really unique about the National Center on Shaken Baby Syndrome's international conference is that they invite families to attend the conference who have survived or been part of a shaking situation. And it's a really unique conference in the sense that you have all these professionals from medical, legal, and prevention. And then you have all these families that are also there to put the reality of these faces to what this actually means and what this looks like. And Gabby is one that I've met several times. She was shaken at 2.5 months old, and of course has to have around-the-clock care, has to have continual help, and has very severe disabilities. But the impacts from being shaken can have really long-lasting impacts onto not just the child who experiences the shaking situation, but also the family, who then has to deal with the aftermath of it. So to check your knowledge, the most common stimulus for shaken baby syndrome or abusive head trauma is which one of these? Rocking chairs or bouncing games, prolonged crying, short falls, jogging with an infant in a stroller, or B and C, or none of those. I kind of have one answer that should be on there, which is some of those. Yes. B is the correct answer, prolonged crying. And it's this lengthy period of crying that takes place. So I want to take some time and talk about what this crying means so that we can come together and raise awareness about this normalcy of infant crying, and also how we need to have strategies for coping with this crying. So the infant crying curve is on your screen. I'm going to show you another version of this coming up, but at 2 weeks of age, what we know is that all infants are going to increase their crying. And it may be so small of an amount of an increase that you really don't even notice it. It may be you thinking, well, we're just getting into our routines, the baby's hungry, we're just settling into things. And so you think, you know, this is pretty normal. But by the 2-month mark, that increase could have continued all the way up to where 5 to 6 hours can still be considered pretty normal. Now, we call the program the period of purple crying because the period of time that this high intense crying can occur is usually over with by the 6th month of life. And so they go up into a peak at about 2 months and then they come back down. So I'm curious, from those of you who are with me, how many of you have had a high crying baby in your life that you survived? And by high crying, I want to say, let's call that somewhere from crying from 2 hours straight to 6 hours straight. How many of you have experienced that? And I have several yeses coming in. So first of all, I'm glad you survived it. Second of all, if you are working with families with new babies, use your story to talk with families about how strategies that maybe worked for you. Letting parents know that can be common and normal, and we really need to be thinking about how we're going to handle it if we do have a situation where that child does cry for a lengthy period of time. Mona, you're saying you had one in childcare. Yeah, so childcare providers, anyone who's caring for the baby needs to know that this is something that can happen. Now, I want to just take a quick moment and talk about research behind this, because what we know when I said all babies go through that high crying phase and that increase in crying, we have lots of research studies that actually show that all babies do this, whether they are preterm, full term, Western civilization, or whether they are hunting and gathering tribes, which parent very differently than Western civilizations do. And we also have research studies that show that some mammals, including chimpanzees, their babies also grew through a period of higher crying. And so this is just part of normal child development. And so you're probably thinking, wait a minute, wasn't this just called colic? I had a colicky baby. How many of you are familiar with this term colic? Or how many of you have heard it, or maybe had a child diagnosed with it, or just think, well, isn't this high crying just colicky? So I want to just do a little bit on colicky, because you may still be hearing this term. And it is an original diagnostic that's referred to having several different components. One is that it's lasting in healthy infants for 3 or more hours a day, for 3 or more days per week, for 3 or more weeks. So the rule of threes. But the term colic was adopted by physicians to just describe what is really normal high crying. And it's not actually a medical diagnostic. So that's really important for us to note, is that what was termed colicky is really just this high crying curve of normal child development. And so we really need to be thinking about how we need to shift how we're talking about this high crying, because there's some dangerous assumptions in the term colic. And one is that this assumption is that infants that had colic and others didn't, which implies that there's something wrong, or there's a diagnosis that needs to happen, and it can kind of stress parents out to think about this term. And then those that had colic could be considered abnormal, or that something was wrong with them, or that the parents weren't taking good enough care of them. And so the use of this term is a little bit dangerous, because it can cause parents to become frustrated with their baby, especially if they assume that something's not normal or not okay. And so we really need to be thinking about how to eliminate this terminology, and how to get parents to recognize that there's nothing abnormal about what they're going through. And instead, we want to have this reframe that colic is just a manifestation of what we call normal behavioral development. And it represents the upper end of the continuum of that crying curve. And so instead of using the term colic, or the next time you hear someone say colicky, try and work your way into that correction to say, you know what, I think a better way of describing that is just to say they're a high crier, because that's really the correct definition of that. And it can be really comforting to parents, particularly if they're brand new parents, to realize that, oh, they're just a high crying baby. And it's a period of time where it's probably going to then come back down to normal levels. So there's a theory then that if this high crying is one of the greatest sources of frustration for parents, that there should be a correlation between abusive head trauma cases and the period of time when there is this high crying taking place. And we have studies that absolutely show that. So the graph on your left is a study done in California that is looking at all the known cases of abusive head trauma in California. And it is showing this peak right here around the 8 to 10 to 12 week mark, which is when the baby could be in the highest period of crying. And we have this spike of when abusive head trauma cases occur, and then we see the curve come back down. And then we also have cases being tracked nationally, where all cases are being looked at, and where we're looking at all stimulus being identified for the cause of an abusive head trauma case. We see a peak happening with this purple line. But when we've been able to track and identify when crying was the actual identified stimulus, we see the exact same peak happening. And so what we know is that there is absolutely a correlation between the period of time when an infant may cry the most and when we have that correlation to the highest rates of abusive head trauma taking place. Now, I don't know if any of you have been paying attention in the last couple of years, but we've been under immense stress with a pandemic and all sorts of things. And science has seemed to come into question by a large body of audience about what is scientific proof, what is scientific evidence, what is true science. And shaken baby syndrome is also one of those areas where there is a field of professionals who question whether the diagnostic is actually a true diagnostic. And it's really important to note that there is a joint consensus statement between 18 international organizations, 2 coming from the United States, which carry heavy weight, of the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, stating that there is no controversy concerning the medical validity and existence of abusive head trauma. And I just want to point that out because some of you may have heard like, gosh, is that really even a thing, or isn't it just physical abuse, or do we really know the cause for this? So if you're still with me at this point, you're probably thinking, whoo, this is some heavy topic. And it is, but it's important. And so I want to just say to you to hold on, because there is good news coming. There's ways we can prevent this. There's things that we can do within the power of our jobs. And the best news of all is that abusive head trauma is preventable, 100% preventable. It is the only form of abuse where we can actually say that. And the reason we can say that is because it's the only form of child maltreatment where we know 2 things. We know when it typically happens, and we know why it typically happens. And we don't get to know those 2 things with other forms of maltreatment. And what we also know is that educating parents about this high crying period is the #1 thing that's going to reduce the incidence of abusive head trauma. And so the key through all of this, if you walk away with nothing else from this session, I want you to just kind of keep these 2 phrases in your mind. One is that the key is crying is normal, and the crying really is not the problem. The problem is how caregivers respond to a baby's crying, or how we respond to sources of frustration. And so I want us to just keep that in mind. It's the how, it's the recognizing our frustrating levels, it's recognizing that we need to have coping strategies, it's recognizing that it's okay to ask for help. And one of the ways we can do this education is through the period of purple crying. And so the Purple program has been around in Kansas for, I think we're going on 13 years at this point. And it's an evidence-based shaken baby syndrome program that has 2 real goals. One of them is, first and foremost, to educate and support caregivers about the understanding of this early infant crying. And then secondarily, and kind of simultaneously, is to reduce those incidents of shaken baby syndrome. And so it is a first and foremost an education program, and then a prevention program. And it is a very widely researched program. It's the most widely researched program in the world, actually, that's looking at correlating reduction in shaken baby syndrome cases. It's been delivered to more than 3 million families at 2,000 hospitals. And up to just a couple of years ago, we had 80% of Kansas hospitals delivering the program to families prior to the family going home with their new baby. We've had some shifts in the programs, and so we currently still have about 36 birthing hospitals that do provide the program materials. But we have felt that it is much more important to reach individuals like you who have the relationships with the families once they get the baby home, who are already looking to you for support and knowledge and resource and information and those things, to help deliver this information to families, because you're the ones with the relationship. And let's be truthful, if they have a normal delivery at the hospital, they may sort of remember getting the information, but they just gave birth. They've got probably people visiting. They're getting bombarded with a whole bunch of other things like safe sleep, which is also highly important. But they're also worrying about, I'm taking this tiny human home and I need to take care of them and keep them alive. So they're probably not retaining all of the key pieces of information from the hospital. The other thing that we really like about Purple is it does not take a lot of time. So this is something you can just incorporate into one of your visits, one of your sessions with your families that will not take a whole lot of time. So work it in as it might work for you. There is research that talks about the support of the program, and when it is delivered, that it actually does show direct correlation to reducing incidence of abusive head trauma. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. If you're interested in the research, I can send that to you as well. But you're probably wondering, what does purple even mean? Why do we call it purple? And so purple actually is an acronym. I never expect anybody to remember what this stands for, but just for your information, the first P stands for peak of crying, meaning it's going to peak at about the 2-month mark. And it usually comes back to a normal level around the 3, 4, 5, 6-month mark. The U stands for unexpected, and that it can come and go and you don't really know why. You've checked the basics. There doesn't really seem to be a reason for this crying. The R stands for resisting soothing. So we can try a lot of those coping mechanisms, but sometimes a baby is just going to resist that soothing technique. The second P stands for pain-like face, which always makes me laugh because I've never been around a baby crying for even 10 minutes that looks like they're having a great time. But when they cry for a long period of time, they start to turn kind of really interesting colors. They look like they're actually physically in pain. And that's what we mean by that second P. The L is long lasting, meaning 5 hours or more. And the E is evening. Now the E is super important for everyone to note, late afternoon and evening hours, because what's happening also at about the 2-month mark, if a parent's been lucky enough to stay home on maternity leave, they're probably going back to work around then, right? And so at the 2-month mark is when we're peaking in our crying. And so let's say I'm using a childcare provider and I drop my child off because I'm going back to work, and I get home with my child at the end of the day and they start crying, and they cry all through the evening, 4 or 5 hours straight. And I'm like, my gosh, what is wrong with my kiddo? And so I call my childcare provider the next day. I say, hey, did anything happen, during the day that maybe they were upset, or how were they? And the childcare provider says to me, they were great. I had no problems at all. Well, that's going to make me feel like a really awful parent, because then I'm thinking, well, my child probably hates me, like I'm doing something wrong. I'm not very good at this. But what if the childcare provider said, instead, you know what, they were great during the day, but this crying you're describing, it sounds like this purple thing that I learned about, and it's normal, and it's usually happens in the evening. Let me get you more information on it. And how much more supported would that parent feel if they had a provider who knew about this and knew that this could be normal child development? So again, this crying curve that happens is going to start to increase at 2 weeks. It's going to peak about the 2nd month of life, give or take, and then it starts to come back down. But one of the biggest stressors for parents is this increase in crying, particularly if they're a brand new parent. And so we need to have abusive head trauma prevention programs, because I've already mentioned the statistics here. But what I also want to just talk about is that while most SBS cases occur in babies up to 6 months of age, it can actually occur into children 5 to 6 years old. And that's going to be dependent upon the size of the child, the intention and the force, and the difference in the potential perpetrator. So just know that we do need to be talking to kiddos and families, even if they have kids beyond age 6 months, about the dangers of shaking and the frustrations of crying and how we need to manage our frustrations. When we are talking to families through your programs, we are effectively reducing the effects of adversities, whether that's our traditional adverse childhood experiences or other kinds of adversities and traumas. What you are doing is providing positive relationships and supports, which are helping to support the protective factors. And what we mean by protective factors is your programs are providing positive attributes that strengthen all families that you are interacting with. You're providing all the same great information to every family, and we're not singling out families. And that's one great thing about Purple, is that we really need to be talking to every family who is expecting a baby or having a new baby, because there is no rhyme or reason as to which family is going to get a high crying baby. There's no rhyme or reason as to which child is going to be the high crying baby. So you could have 3 kiddos, and kiddo number 4 is the high crying child. And what we also know is that crying can make the most rational person do completely irrational things. And so we need to be making sure we're talking to every family every time they're expecting a child. And you are providing the hope and supports to families through your connections, your check-ins, your resources. Just your listening ear is very oftentimes the thing that a family needs. We have a lot of ways that Purple supports the protective factors, but for sake of time, I want to skip over that and just get to the nitty-gritty of what do you need to know to actually share this information with your families, because I want to make sure that you have access to this information. So the very first thing, if you're working with families who have a new baby, is ask them questions, right? We want to ask them, do you know that it's okay to walk away for a few minutes when a baby's crying becomes really frustrating? You'll be surprised how many families and parents will tell you, of course, I don't think that's okay. I need to hold them. I need to swaddle them. I need to carry and comfort them. And of course, those are things we're going to try when a baby is crying. But if we start to feel frustrated as the parent, we need to know that it's okay to put that child down in a safe place and go take an adult timeout. And I say we want to ask this because I always think back to a story that a hospital, one of our Kansas hospitals, shared with me several years ago about how they talked about purple when the mom delivered the new baby, but dad was not present at that particular conversation. And about 2 months later, the dad, who was the primary caregiver of this infant, came back to the hospital and asked for help because he was having thoughts of suicide and thoughts of harming the baby. And when the hospital staff who were talking with him asked him what was going on, he was so stressed with this crying. And he was under the impression as a new dad that he could not put the baby down because he felt like if it was crying and it was upset, he needed to carry it and comfort it and try and, soothe it. But as he's getting frustrated with a high crying baby, what's that baby picking up on? The frustration, right? And the stress. And so it's just a cycle. And so they told him about purple. They taught him about some of the strategies he could use. And he was like, I had no idea it was okay to put a baby down in a safe place, even if they were crying. And so we've got to get over these assumptions that we're making and just ask these questions. And then we also want to be asking families, do you have a plan for what to do if your baby goes through this period of high crying? Because you never get to know which one's coming. There are purple materials that you can use that we can provide you. This is kind of a screenshot and a snapshot, and it is a little booklet, which I'm going to try and hold up and see if it will work for you. So it's a little half sheet booklet. And then on the booklet is an app code. So there's an app code that parents can use to download this information, have access to the videos and the resources available. But for you as a professional, all I need for you all to do is email me that you were in this session today, and I can email you a permanent app code that you can have on your device to be able to use and share with your families, or say, hey, did you get this information? If not, let me show you some of the pieces of information on your smart device. So I'm going to drop my email in the chat just for ease of sake. You can also find it in the conference information. So all you need to do is just email me that you were in this, and I can send you your own permanent app code. And then we can also send you materials to use, which I'll get to in a minute. In the materials themselves, there are all kinds of things that parents might find helpful. And I say might because this is not for everybody. But there is a tracking system in here. There are notifications a parent can get about milestones in the CDC development stages. There is a way, if you're a child care provider, that you can create profiles for multiple babies to track, which you can then provide to parents or talk with them about all these different things that are happening with the baby during the day. There's lots of different articles that are available. And then of course, the primary 2 videos are available, which is the longer video that hospitals are typically showing if they are still implementing, and then a shorter one that is talking about some coping strategies that parents can use. So if you are going to use the purple materials, what we recommend doing is just taking out the booklet on your home visit and saying, did you ever get one of these? Have you ever seen this? And if not, providing it to the parent. And then ask them to download the app if they want to. They don't have to, but it is nice to have that resource available. But you can also show them the information on your own device if you have your own code. And then we always just say, recommend flipping through that little booklet. It's really short. It's super easy. And that way you don't have to memorize anything. So you can just look at the key questions and the key things on the pages. And we try and make this as simplistic as possible. But we really want to be having you reminding parents, whether you're using these materials or not, that infant crying is normal, that it is going to increase. Whether it's going to be a high increase or not is going to be determined by time. We also want parents to know that that 5 to 6 hours can be completely normal child development, but that it's also really stressful. And of course, we want parents to be checking in with their pediatricians if they do get a high crier, just to make sure there's nothing else going on, that there's no medical conditions that need to be addressed, those kinds of things. But we also want parents to know that shaking is dangerous. Even 1 to 2 shakes is incredibly dangerous. And so it's okay to put the baby in a safe space. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay not to have a Facebook perfect life, and to let people know that we are struggling in the early months of being a parent. And then what we like to say we want you to use as a strategy is the teach back method. And this is the method to use with really anything that you are trying to communicate with your parents that you are working with. And so teach back is really a way to ask parents if they have understood the information that you have provided to them. Because typically what we do is we lay out all of our information and then we say, do you have any questions? And what do we usually get? No, I'm good, right? That's usually what we get. And that's great if they don't have any questions, but that doesn't really tell us if they've actually learned anything or if they've actually been able to retain the information. And so you can start with that as your conversation. Do you have any questions? No, I think I'm okay. Okay, great. The teach back method is, what would you tell someone else about purple? Or what would you do if you had a high crying baby? Or how are you going to talk to your mom about safe sleep practices when they're taking care of the baby for you during the day? So we want to make sure that we're just communicating this teach back method. And then that tells us if they can't answer that question that you're trying to get them to answer, that's your method then to reiterate the information. So we also want to be sure that we're communicating with family strategies they can try with a crying baby. So of course, check the basics. There's lots of soothing techniques that can be tried, noise techniques and white noise strategies. If you have teenagers, ask your kids if they know what white noise is, particularly if they're babysitting, because when we go out and talk to teenagers and high school groups, we always get, what do you mean by white noise? And so ask them if they know what white noise is, because it can be really beneficial for them to know about. We also want people to know it's okay to take in a responsible adult timeout. And then we also want to make sure that we are letting people know that the crying will end. It just might take a little while for it to happen. So we want to make sure we're not shaking or harming the baby. So we want you to partner with us because you are the ones that have the relationships with your families. And so this is anyone who would see the family prenatally, anyone who would see the family in the first few months or couple years of life. But if you are one of those professionals, please let me know somehow so that we can get you your own permanent purple app codes, so that we can get you program materials that you can provide to your families. There is no cost for this. We have a grant that funds the materials and the programs. We would love to get these in the hands of families and for you to utilize as needed. And I also want to just make a quick note. Don't forget about the dads, because I know a lot of us tend to focus on the moms because the moms are the ones who gave birth and we do need to be supporting moms, but don't forget about the dads who are also around or maybe missing some of your appointments. It is vital that we give the new fathers the tools they need so that they know what to expect with parenting and they know what they can do to help nurture that relationship during these crucial times. And I was just in a meeting this morning where someone out of Kansas City who does really great work with families in some of the harder metro areas said, one of the greatest things that happens when I work with families is that they recognize there's more to parenting than just having a baby. And I think you all probably can identify with that, because when you start to work with families, you recognize, where the gaps in knowledge are, where the misinformation is, and have to work really hard at correcting that and getting parents to come around sometimes to some new strategies to try. But we want to make sure we're reaching both the moms and the dads. There are some parent websites that you can utilize to have some research information and articles. Purplecrying.info is the primary one I would recommend checking out, but there's articles out there designed with the parent in mind. So they're not written at this real high, they're not real jargony, they're not technologically difficult to read, which I always appreciate. And they're really just, written for parents to recognize and have some supports that you can utilize as well. And I want to just talk real briefly about when things can go wrong in this type of a scenario. So one is failure to reach every parent every time. So a long time ago, when I went on a hospital visit to one of our partnered hospitals, they weren't delivering the information to every single new parent when they were having their baby. And I said, well, why is that? And they said, well, we're really good at identifying the families that are high risk. And I said, that's great that you are focusing on high risk families, because we definitely want to be reaching our high risk families, right? There's a reason we've deemed them or identified them having higher risk. But what I like to say is no family is immune to the stress from high crying. And it doesn't matter your education level. It doesn't matter your support level. You never know how you're going to feel at 10 o'clock at night after you've been listening to a baby cry for 5 solid hours when you're going to reach your breaking points. We've got to be reaching every parent every time. We do want to be considering family risk factors, but never assume just because they don't have risk factors that they are not at risk for the dangers of potentially being in this situation. And when in doubt, we want people to report suspicions of abusive head trauma or physical abuse, of course, to the Department for Children and Families, because sometimes making those reports actually gets the family connected to the services and support that they actually really do need. And if you have questions on mandated reporting, that's one of my primary roles. I will be happy to provide training for your organizations. So I have one last story that I want to just share with you about how purple can really make a difference. And I have some screenshots of the story on your screen, but I'm going to read this to you. And this is from both a friend and a colleague of mine. And she said, in May, I welcomed my son into the world. This was May of a couple years ago. My husband and I had waited years to have a child, and he was finally here. I was hardly even nervous because I had 20 years of experience working with families in childcare and summer camps, teaching, parent education, and counseling. I knew I would be just fine, and I knew I would handle the role of motherhood with ease. And I was so wrong. How many of you have worked with families who felt that way, right? This is going to be the best thing ever. And then they get into this and they're like, oh my gosh, what have I done? So my colleague says, nothing can prepare you for the changes that occur in your life when you bring a new baby home. Nothing can prepare you for the helpless feelings you get when you cannot soothe your crying baby. I knew about purple, and I knew my son would cry more as the weeks went on. I knew I should set him down in a safe place and walk away if I felt overwhelmed. I knew it was totally normal behavior for a newborn to cry for long periods of time. I'm so grateful I knew all of these facts because they helped me navigate my role as a new mom when my emotions wanted to take over. What I didn't realize is how the sound of my son's crying could create a panicked feeling in my heart. I didn't realize that his cries, when unable to be soothed, would make me feel like a terrible parent in those early months of his life. What kind of mother can't soothe her baby? I may have let myself believe those thoughts had I not known about purple. So when teaching families about purple as a parent educator, I always thought a baby's cries created stress for a parent because they're high-pitched and piercing. And yes, that is stressful, but me as a new mom, the real stress came from not being able to fix the situation, and the frustration can be overwhelming. In those times, I reminded myself of the facts I knew about crying, and I leaned on my closest friends to help me through. I knew the Purple campaign was important for families, but I didn't realize how important until I brought my own child home and felt the uncertainty, the stress, the love, and the enormous responsibility you feel when you're caring for your child. And I think that is the best summary ever. This is an educated, supported professional who had a new baby and still had all of this stress take place. And so when you have friends, family, clients with new babies, we need to be checking in on them and just making sure that they're okay. And I remember very distinctly getting a text message from her at about the 8-week mark. And she said, hey, you know that purple thing you talk about all the time? It's real. And at that point, I knew I just needed to check in with her pretty regularly and say, hey, how's it going? I would send her memes, I would check in and stop in, and just let her know that it's okay, and just some good, gentle reminders. And we need to be doing that for others. We can also be providing some supports for parents too, such as the 1-800-CHILDREN, which is the judgment-free parenting support line. So if you are working with families, I would highly recommend having the magnets or the palm cards available to provide to your families, because even if it's at 1 a.m. in the morning and that baby's crying for 5 straight hours, they can call 1-800-CHILDREN and have someone to talk to and just have a listening ear on the other line. It's available with the language app. So there's 200 different languages it can service, and it is staffed 24 hours a day, and it is truly judgment-free. It's also an app you can download as a professional to help search for resources, but really in this context, we want parents to know that it exists to support them. So I want to wrap up in my last minute by just saying this quote. And Dr. Barr is the founder of National Center on Shaken Baby Syndrome and the Period of Purple Crying. And I love his quote that says, soothing works some of the time, but nothing works all of the time. And the second quote is, if parents and family members can be informed about the dangers of shaking a baby before they are faced with an inconsolable crying infant, the problem, meaning shaken baby syndrome, can be prevented. And so that comes through all of you doing the information, the resource providing, the relationships of connection, the supports, providing the hope that you do. Never underestimate the role that you are in with the families you are serving. And if you think you can utilize 1-800-CHILDREN or Purple materials, just shoot me an email at any given point, and I will get you connected to where we can send you that information. And otherwise, I will let you all go. I will hang on if there are questions. I do have my email in the chat. It's also on your screen, and then it's also linked in my bio on the platform. And so, Carrie, are there other things you need to wrap up with?
No, but there was a question that came in. Where do I get the magnets for the 1-800-CHILDREN?
Yes, so that's through us as well. And again, there's no charge for the magnets or the palm cards. And so if you just want to shoot me an email, I will redirect that to the program staff who run 1-800-CHILDREN, and they will get that out to you and mailed out. They're usually pretty quick turnaround too.
All right. If there are any other questions, feel free to unmute or raise your hand and we will get you unmuted, or type them into either chat. Lots of thank yous.
Yeah, let's see those. Really, the thank yous to all of you for everything that you all do,
Right.
because you have the hard work. I like to summarize my job by just saying I tell people things. You all actually do the hard work of the relationships. Right. So
that's right.
So thank you everyone for attending today. And I hope you've had a great conference.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Rochelle.
Thanks so much. Have a great afternoon.
You too.